He guarded Michael Jackson for 30 years and said nothing. His first interview changed everything. His hands were shaking when he sat down in front of the camera. 71 years old. Retired. Living quietly in a small house in Encino, California, nobody knew his name. Nobody had ever asked. For 30 years, James Rowe had been invisible by design. That was the job. Stand close. See everything. Say nothing. But Michael Jackson had been dead for 15 years, and James Rowe was running out of time. So he finally talked. And what he said changed everything. People thought they knew. Let me take you back, not to the concerts, not to the headlines, not to the trials or the tabloids or the chaos. To the moments nobody filmed, nobody reported, nobody ever knew about, because James Rowe was there for all of them. April 1993. Detroit, Michigan. The Dangerous World Tour. James Rowe was 38 years old and 3 months into the job. Former Marine, 6'4", 220 pounds. He had protected senators, celebrities, a foreign dignitary once. But he had never seen anything like Michael Jackson, not the performances, not the screaming crowds. Something else entirely. It was his 3rd week on the job when it happened. The first time, the tour bus had stopped at a red light on the way back from soundcheck. 2 a.m, empty streets, and Michael Jackson suddenly said one word: stop. The driver stopped. Security protocols said keep moving. James almost overruled it. But Michael was already out of the bus. James followed, hand on his radio, eyes scanning. Michael had walked 20 feet to a bus shelter. A homeless man was sitting there, old, thin, shaking in the cold. Michael sat down next to him, not standing over him, next to him, on that dirty bench, in his stage clothes. James watched, hand still on his radio. They sat there for 11 minutes. Michael never reached for his wallet, never made a show of anything. He just sat, and talked, and listened. When Michael finally stood up, he pressed something into the man's hand, folded, small, quiet. James never saw how much it was. He never asked. On the way back to the bus, Michael said nothing, just looked straight ahead. That was the first time James understood he was guarding someone different. But that wasn't even the most incredible part. The real pattern started revealing itself slowly, over months, over years, and nobody knew. Because Michael had one absolute rule: no cameras, no press, no credit. James heard him say it once to his manager firm. Final. If it gets out, it stops. That was the rule. So James kept the secret for 30 years. November 1995, London, Wembley Arena, pre-show. 2 hours before doors opened, Michael had slipped out of the venue through a service exit. Just him and James, no other security. Michael had specifically asked for that. They took a black car to a children's hospital 40 minutes away. No appointment, no press release, no charity photo opportunity. Michael walked through the pediatric ward with a single staff member who had been quietly notified. Ward by ward, room by room, James stood at the end of each hallway. He watched Michael sit at the edge of every single bed, not standing. Sitting, at eye level. Every single child. Some kids were sleeping. Michael didn't wake them. He just sat for a moment, quietly, then moved on. One room had a boy, maybe 7 years old, bald from chemotherapy, awake, frightened looking. Michael stayed in that room for 22 minutes. James timed it, because they had a show in 2 hours, and he was calculating logistics in his head. When they left the hospital, Michael got into the car and didn't speak for the entire 40-minute drive back. James didn't speak either. That was the job. They did that visit, and then Michael walked on stage in front of 70,000 people and performed like nothing had happened. 2.5 hours, full energy. Every move, perfect. James always remembered that. The distance between those 2 rooms, the hospital room and the stage, and how Michael carried both of them at the same time. Here is the thing most people never understood. Michael Jackson visited 237 hospitals in 14 countries over the course of his career. James had the records. He kept them himself, in a notebook. Every date, every city, every hospital name. Not one of those visits was ever announced in advance. Not one was ever used in a press release. Not one photograph was ever officially released. The only photos that exist were taken by hospital staff on personal cameras, blurry, informal, never sold. Because Michael's lawyers sent a letter to every single hospital, before every visit, one condition: no media, no announcements, no exceptions. Some hospitals broke the rule after the fact. Michael never went back to those ones. James knew this because he managed the list. But the story James had carried the longest, the one that made him finally agree to the interview, before that, one more thing: New York City, 3 weeks before the Madison Square Garden concerts. Michael had disappeared for 6 hours. No schedule, no security detail, just gone. James had spent those 6 hours making quiet calls, tracking, waiting. Not panicking outwardly, but calculating every worst-case scenario internally. Michael came back at 11 p.m. alone. Walked past James in the hotel corridor without stopping. James noticed his shoes. Dusty. Like he had been walking somewhere for a long time. He never found out where Michael had gone that day. He asked once carefully the next morning. Michael smiled and said he had needed to think. James left it there. But 2 weeks later, a community center in the Bronx received an anonymous donation: new music equipment, full recording setup, enough for 100 kids a year. James only connected those two things later. Much later. He added the date to his notebook anyway. Just the date. No explanation. Some pages were like that. That one happened in 1997. Munich, Germany. The History World Tour. A letter had arrived backstage, handwritten. A mother had written it. Her daughter was 9 years old, terminal diagnosis. Leukemia. The doctors had given her 3 months. The girl had one wish: not to meet Michael Jackson. She wasn't asking for that. She knew it was impossible. She just wanted to hear "Heal the World One More Time" live. She had heard it on a cassette tape her father had given her before he left. She had listened to it every single day for 2 years. The tape had worn through. The mother wasn't asking for tickets. She couldn't afford to travel from the small town in Bavaria where they lived. 4 hours from Munich. She was just writing because she didn't know what else to do. She had written to 15 people: charities, local officials, a newspaper. Michael Jackson's fan club. Nobody answered, except one. James found out about it because Michael handed him the letter and said 4 words: "Find them for me." James made 7 phone calls, had an address in 40 minutes. He had done harder things logistically: moving a principal through hostile crowds, coordinating evacuation routes in 3 languages, managing security for a stadium of 90,000 people. But something about those 7 phone calls felt different. He couldn't explain it then. He could later. It was the first time in his career he had made calls. Not because it was protocol, but because a little girl in Bavaria had worn through a cassette tape and her mother had written 15 letters, and only one person had written back. Michael didn't send tickets, didn't send money. He sent a car. The mother and daughter arrived backstage at 8 p.m., 2 hours before showtime. James escorted them personally. He watched Michael sit with that little girl for 45 minutes in a room backstage while the crew ran final checks around them. Nobody rushed him. Nobody knocked on the door. James had made sure of that. At 9 p.m. the show started. The mother and daughter were in the front row, seats that didn't exist on any ticket manifest. James had arranged that too. When Heal the World started, James was standing 15 feet from that little girl. He watched her face. He never forgot it. After the show, an envelope was delivered to their hotel. James had organized it. Inside was enough money to cover the girl's medical treatment for 1 full year. No note, no name, clean bills through a lawyer. The mother tried to find out who sent it. She never could. The girl lived for 14 more months. Not 3. James found that out years later. He had kept the mother's address. There was one more thing James carried. In 1999, during the last leg of the history tour, Michael had asked James a question out of nowhere. They were in a car, late night. Another city, another arena behind them. Michael asked him if he thought any of it mattered. The visits, the envelopes, the quiet things. James said yes. Michael looked out the window for a long time. Then he said he just needed to hear someone else say it. James never forgot that either. After Michael died in June 2009, James retired, moved to Encino, kept the notebook. For 15 years he said nothing. In those 15 years James had been asked 3 times, 2 journalists, 1 documentary producer. All 3 found him through different channels. All 3 showed up with different angles. One wanted the tour stories, one wanted the trial, one wanted what she called the real Michael. James had turned all 3 away at the door, not because he was protecting a reputation, not because of any legal agreement. There was no NDA. Michael had never asked him to sign anything. He turned them away because none of them had asked the right question. They all came with a story already written. They just needed quotes to fill in the gaps. James could tell within the first 2 minutes every time. The notebook deserved better than that. So he waited, kept the notebook in a fireproof box under his bed, kept the mother's letter inside it, kept all 237 dates and cities and hospital names exactly as he had written them. Then, in 2024, a journalist named Carol Weiss found him through a former tour crew member. She knocked on his door on a Tuesday afternoon. James almost didn't open it. But Carol hadn't come with a story. She had come with a question. One simple question. She asked him what he had seen that nobody else had. That was the right question. But he thought about the notebook, and the girl in Munich, and the homeless man in Detroit, and 237 hospitals in 14 countries. He thought about all of it sitting in a notebook that nobody would ever read. So he opened the door. The interview ran for 4 hours. Carol published it across 3 parts. 2 million readers in the first week. The comments section filled with names. Nurses from hospitals in Tokyo and São Paulo and Johannesburg. Tour crew members from 3 different continents. Lawyers who had managed the anonymous transfers and never spoken publicly. One by one, quietly, the full picture came into focus. Not the Michael Jackson of the headlines. Not the trial. Not the tabloids. The one James had watched for 30 years. The one who sat on dirty benches at 2 in the morning, who timed his own visits by the logistics of the show schedule, who sent cars to small towns in Bavaria and never left his name. In the interview, Carol asked James one question directly. Why did he never talk? For 30 years. Why? James was quiet for a long time. Then he said Michael had told him something once. Early on, first year of the job, he said real kindness disappears when it becomes a story. The moment it is a story, it is not kindness anymore. It is something else. James said he believed that. For 30 years he believed that, and he had tested it once. Early on, 1994, he had mentioned one of the hospital visits to a journalist he knew personally. Just in passing, nothing specific. No names, no dates. 3 days later, Michael called him into a room, closed the door. Didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten anything. He just looked at James and said he was disappointed. James said that was the hardest conversation of his professional life, harder than anything in the Marines. A man looking at him quietly and saying he was disappointed. He never spoke to another journalist again until Carol knocked on his door in 2024. But then he said something else. He said he was 71 years old and the notebook existed, and someone needed to know what was in it, not for Michael's reputation, not for any foundation or estate or legacy campaign, just because it happened. And it was true. And true things should not disappear. Today, James Rowe's notebook is housed at a museum archive in Los Angeles. Every page preserved. 237 hospital visits. 14 countries. 31 years. All of it quiet. All of it real. All of it true. On the cover of the notebook, in James's handwriting, there is a single line he wrote the day Michael died. It says, he never wanted credit. He just wanted it done. That line is now on a plaque outside the children's wing of a hospital in Munich, Germany. The family asked for it to be put there. They never said whose name it referred to. They didn't have to. If this story moved you, please subscribe and hit the like button. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the most important things happen quietly. Have you ever witnessed a moment of kindness that nobody else saw? Tell us in the comments. Turn on notifications. More stories like this one are coming.